I now call on members' order of the day. Number 1, Dr Kennedy Graham.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move that the House note the report entitled Net Zero in New Zealand, Scenarios to Achieve Domestic Emissions Neutrality in the Second Half of the Century, prepared by Vivid Economics on behalf of Globe New Zealand.
The member just proceeds with his speech.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to table the report.
Leave us talk. I think this is a significant moment. I will certainly put the leave, but I do not acknowledge that it's been well distributed. Yeah. Leave us sought to table that particular Globe report. Is there any objection to it being tabled? There is not. It can be tabled. Dr Kennedy Graham.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The debate this afternoon marks the end of the Vivid project and the beginning of something new in New Zealand climate policy. I thank all the members of Globe New Zealand for their collegial engagement, especially the Executive Committee of Honourable Peter Dunn, Marama Fox, Tracy Martin, Scott Simpson and Dr Megan Woods. And appreciation, of course, to the Minister and to yourself as Speaker for your high levels of interest and support. The Vivid report reflects unprecedented cross-party collaboration. It provides an opportunity for developing an ambitious pathway to domestic emissions neutrality as called for in the Paris Agreement. Nothing is more critical to the fate of New Zealand and the well-being of future generations. I think the very fact that this debate is being held testifies to that. May I pay tribute to the Vivid team in London, John Ward, Alex Kazaglis and Paul Salmon, who now know New Zealand better than they ever dreamed they would, but also to their broader team in London as well. And of course, the donors here in New Zealand for making it possible. And may I single out Sir Stephen Tyndall, who led in that respect. And finally, to Catherine Lining, our Wellington-based consultant, to whom we all owe a huge vote of thanks. James Shaw will convey the Green Party's initial views on the report itself. I shall confine myself to a broader observation, which is perhaps more a green perspective on the shared vision that is Globe New Zealand. I do so because only weeks after its release and with an election ahead, we must nonetheless ask ourselves, where to from here? The report identifies 4 scenarios for achieving emissions neutrality, 3 of which would achieve the goal in the second half of the century as Paris Agreement calls for. We shall no doubt be discussing within our cross-party group which of these, or which combination of them, might have the most policy merit. For ultimately we need to move from scenarios to policy. The tectonic tension in this respect will be over 2 broad considerations: the speed with which we must move on the one hand, and the need for economic stability and distributional justice as we go, the imperative of urgency and the art of transition. We shall all have our views. From my personal perspective, I think the following. I have been working on climate change, sir, on climate change since 1989. The first IPCC report of 1990 and the Rio Convention of 92 made clear the consequences of dangerous climate change and the need to avoid it. Since then, our annual global emissions have risen hugely, and so have our national emissions. We have lost a quarter of a century through largely ineffectual old-style negotiations, which we pursue in short-term, competitive, zero-sum style. That is not the way to solve 21st century global commons problems. I say this more in sorrow than anger. We are where we are, but it leaves us with a far higher gradient of challenge than when we started, and we have very little time left. It was only yesterday that Christiana Figueres, former UN climate head and now UN climate ambassador, identified 2020 as the year in which global carbon emissions must peak for the 2-degree goal in the Paris Agreement to be realised. So where to from here for New Zealand? I believe the report will be invaluable in facilitating cross-party policy debate and throughout the country. In particular, I hope that we can pursue in more depth the challenge posed in Scenario 4 of the report, neutrality by 2050. I know this will be difficult, but I know it also to be an imperative. And a broader challenge, to place domestic neutrality in the context of New Zealand's overall national responsibility level within the finite and diminishing global carbon budget. So, Mr. Speaker, let us continue our discussions informally around the table and see how far and how fast we can proceed blending short-term and longer-term responsibilities. Because ultimately, they are one and the same, and ultimately, we are all in this extraordinary saga together.
Scott Simpson. With a message to the good people of Coromandel.